So for our project, we will be presenting on mental health issues among LGBTQ youth. So to begin, introducing the problem that we researched is that LGBTQ youth report higher rates of mental health problems, including higher rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation than heterosexual youth. Many researchers turn to the minority stress theory as a viable explanation as to why LGBTQ youth may be more susceptible to mental health problems. The minority stress theory proposes that sexual minorities are subjected to distinct and chronic stress that will often result in adverse behavioral and mental health outcomes that are disproportionate to other comparable populations. Essentially, this is to say that there's a chronic stress that LGBTQ youth face since they tend to be stigmatized during their identity development stage due to their sexual orientation or identities. The key driver for this chronic stress includes stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and victimization, which stem from a homophobic culture. Some minority stressors include a broad range of experiences, such as internalized homophobia, rejection sensitivity, concealment, family rejection, and bias-based victimization, such as hate crimes. In a 2018 study, 70% of LGBTQ youth indicated they had been verbally harassed at school due to their sexual orientation. Another study found that 40% of LGBTQ individuals reported a family member or friend had rejected them because of their gender identity and sexual orientation. In a paper written by Janelle Taylor in 2019, she identifies a group of risk factors and protective factors which relate to mental health issues in LGBTQ youth. First, she identified victimization as one of the risk factors, and this includes verbal harassment, and physical assault. Experiencing victimization can lead to PTSD, sleep issues, anxiety, depression, drug use, and increased suicide attempts. Victimization threatens the victim's sense of security and invulnerability and causes them to respond with self-recrimination and self-devaluation. The next risk factor that Taylor identified is perceived discrimination. This is defined in the article as extent to which LGBTQ youth perceived that they'd been discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation. Perceived discrimination has been found to be associated with a harmful quality of life and indicators of psychiatric comorbidity, as well as leading to increased symptoms of depression, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. Next, Taylor also identified family rejection, and she reported this as a significant stressor. It involves acts of discrimination, disownment, or removal from the family home, and LGBTQ individuals who came out to their family tended to experience more verbal and physical harassment from their family than those who do not disclose. It is also associated with increased suicide attempts, high levels of depression, and illegal drug use. Additionally, Taylor found that it puts LGBTQ youth at an increased risk of homelessness. She reported that LGBTQ youth make up 40% of homelessness agency clientele, and the main reason that they reported for their homelessness was family rejection. And the last risk factor that Taylor identified was maladaptive coping strategies, and this includes rumination, substance abuse, concealing their stigmatized identity, learning to hide, and self-blame. She wrote that these may develop as responses to the above risk factors, and they often exacerbate the negative effects of those factors. In contrast, Taylor also identified protective factors, the first of which is family and social support. She found that LGBTQ youth who experience family acceptance experience better health and well-being, and it's also associated with higher levels of self-esteem, social support, general health, and it protects against depression, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation attempts. Social support can lead to greater emotional and behavioral adjustment for LGBTQ youth, and it's also associated with high levels of self-esteem, fewer depressive episodes, and fewer suicidal thoughts. And the last of the protective factors is having an affirming and protective school environment. And an example of this is the Gay Straight Alliance clubs that are often found in many schools. Attending a school with an affirming environment has been seen to be associated with more school belonging and less at-school victimization. Other school-related policies that Taylor talked about that lead to better mental health outcomes for LGBTQ youth include living in states with anti-bullying laws related to sexual orientation, including inclusive curriculum for the students, and also including professional development trainings which relate to the experiences of LGBTQ youth.
So discriminatory behaviors against the general LGBTQ plus community can range from everyday slights and microaggressions to fear of assault and violent attack. Structural stigma, which is societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional policies and practices that constrain the opportunities, resources, and well-being of the stigmatized, can also have a significant impact on the health of marginalized groups, including sexual minorities. For example, in a study in 2014 found that states with higher levels of anti-gay structural stigma have increased mortality rates among LGBTQ plus people. For LGBTQ plus individuals, the stress associated with discrimination and social stigma creates greater risk for health problems and subject LGBTQ plus people to health disparities. As discussed in the introduction, the minority stress theory posits that stress brought on by discrimination, prejudice, or oppressive treatment influences health behaviors and can worsen health outcomes for people who are targeted by social rejection. The model describes how society stigmatizing homophobic messaging leaves LGBTQ plus people susceptible to damaging internalizations and poor self-concepts, which then contribute to negative health outcomes. Furthermore, multiple minority statuses can have additive dimensions of stress. For example, LGBTQ women may have increased levels of stress due to LGBT victimization, internalized heterosexism, and concealment. But I'll go over more about the added stress of racial discrimination on the next slide. So rejection from social, family, and peer groups can be a key trigger for distress in LGBTQ plus youth. And the risk of rejection is potentially greater for those who are also at risk of racist or sexist bias, for example, young women of color. In addition to racism, exclusion, and sexual objectification that LGBTQ plus people of color experience within the LGBTQ plus community, many of them are also distanced from or rejected by their ethno-racial and or cultural communities. Experiences of racism can alienate LGBTQ plus people of color from LGBTQ plus spaces, and the dominance of heterosexism within their own cultural communities can lead to the individual concealing their sexual identity or gender identity in order to escape experiencing additional social persecution or humiliation. LGBTQ plus people of color have to deal with the reality of facing multiple oppressions, including racism, homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexist discrimination. LGBTQ plus people of color are also just a very diverse group, consisting of both monoracial and multiracial people of color. And for LGBTQ plus people of color, there can be a unique multiplicity of stressors across race, sexual identity, and gender. A study in 2020 found that LGBTQ plus people of color that for LGBTQ POC, internalized heterosexism plays a particularly large role in predicting a person's sense of connection to the LGBTQ community. And perceiving racism within LGBTQ communities further compounds one's ability to experience connection with other LGBTQ people of color, which was more pronounced among multiracial people of color. But additionally, experiences of outright racism within the LGBTQ community can complicate LGBTQ plus POC experiences with racist oppression by adding a dimension of marginalization within a community where there is a shared identity based on sexual identity and or gender expression. So one way to address discrimination and mental health issues among LGBTQ youth is to promote more family-centered interventions. So for example, there's a project called Family Acceptance Project, which works to decrease major health and related risks, such as suicide, substance abuse, HIV, and homelessness for LGBTQ youth in the context of their families. So it's research based and it's culturally grounded to help ethnically, socially, and religiously diverse families decrease rejection and increase support for their LGBT children. This is really important because social support and family acceptance plays a large role in preventing LGBTQ homelessness and reducing the likelihood of ending up in prison. Another way to address discrimination and mental health issues among LGBTQ youth is to establish more gay-straight alliances in schools and raising awareness to reduce harassment and bullying experienced by LGBTQ plus youth. Gay Straight Alliance groups are groups of individuals devoted to serving the needs of LGBTQ people while working with straight allies. Another study in 2014 suggested that the normalizing process experienced in GSA groups has a profound positive effect on the social, academic, and familial experiences of LGBTQ plus youth. Programs like the GSA that promote acceptance are just overall helpful in creating a safe learning environment for LGBTQ adolescents.
All right, next we're going to talk about health disparities among LGBTQ youth. To begin, let's just review what health disparities are. According to the CDC, health disparities are preventable differences in the burden of disease, injury, violence, or opportunities to achieve optimal health that are experienced by socially disadvantaged populations. So since the focus of this project obviously is on mental health issues for LGBTQ community, let's start with the disparities in mental illnesses within this community. So as you can see on the slide, LGBTQ individuals are more than twice as likely as heterosexual men and women to have a mental health disorder in their lifetime. LGBTQ individuals are also 2.5 times more likely to experience depression, anxiety, substance misuse compared to heterosexual individuals. And women who identify as lesbian or bisexual are more than twice as likely to engage in heavy alcohol drinking in the past month than heterosexual women. Furthermore, gay and bisexual men were less likely than heterosexual men to engage in heavy drinking in the past month. Also, as you can see on this chart on the slide, LGBTQ individuals have higher rates of suicidal thoughts compared to their heterosexual counterparts. As you can see, the numbers are pretty jarring there. So this becomes even more severe when race is added to the equation, as transgender individuals who identify as African American or Black, or Hispanic or Latinx, American Indian, or multiracial or mixed race, they are all at an increased risk of suicide attempts than white transgender individuals. And this is apparent in youth, but it continues throughout the lifetime as LGBTQ older adults face a number of unique challenges, including the combination of anti-LGBTQ stigma and ageism. So even though we're focusing on the problems that have to do with youth, these problems will most likely follow these people throughout their lives. Approximately 31% of LGBTQ older adults report depressive symptoms. 39% report serious thoughts of taking their own lives. So while, again, we are focusing on the youth, it's very important to consider how these issues are going to affect their entire lives. So as we can clearly see through the data provided, there are health risks associated with being a person who is part of the LGBTQ community. Furthermore, health disparities are made worse by stigma and discrimination, which were kind of touched on the last slides as well. Many LGBTQ people have reported experiencing stigma and discrimination when accessing health services, leading to individuals to delay necessary healthcare or forego it altogether. So therefore, they might postpone going to the doctor even when they have a serious illness, which may mean worsening their chances at recovery. LGBTQ individuals also have less social support than their heterosexual counterparts, particularly if they live in a region without a large LGBTQ population, or if they have experienced rejection by their family because of their sexual orientation. And bisexual people in particular will feel more isolated because they experience stigma from both the society at large as well as stigma within the LGBTQ community. Transgender individuals also have higher rates of poverty and unemployment compared to non-transgender individuals, and this is actually exacerbated by a lack of federal employment and non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ individuals. And finally, LGBTQ individuals are more likely to be victims of violence compared to their heterosexual peers. So the risk of experiencing violence is even higher for undocumented and racial ethnic minority LGBTQ. So not only do these things happen to people in the LGBTQ community, but more often than heterosexual youth, but the disparities are exacerbated by the fear and the trauma associated with being a victim to these things. LGBTQ youth are more than twice as likely to not go to school because of safety concerns or because of having ever been forced to have sexual intercourse, because of physical dating violence or sexual dating violence, because of feeling sad or hopeless, or because of having seriously considered attempting suicide. This leaves more room for health disparities because if these kids aren't going to school and aren't going to the doctor, they won't have the educational and therefore occupational opportunities of their heterosexual peers. Not only that, but living with the constant stress that comes with being in an oppressed group takes a physical toll in and of itself. So what are the possible solutions for these things? Schools are the main starting point for addressing health-related behaviors of sexual minority students. Schools can help reduce stigma and discrimination by creating a positive school environment, and those are associated with less suicide ideation, fewer suicide attempts, lower prevalence of substance use, and fewer school absences among sexual minority students. According to the CDC website, this might be accomplished through the following policies and practices. So first, encouraging respect for all students and not allowing bullying, harassment, or violence against any student for any reason. The next thing is identifying safe spaces such as counseling offices, designated classrooms, or student organizations where sexual minority students can get support from administrators, teachers, or other school staff, just letting them know that they have a safe place. Next is encouraging student-led and student-organized school clubs, such as gay-straight alliances that promote school connectedness and a safe, welcoming, and accepting school environment for all students. Next is ensuring that health classes and educational materials include information that is relevant to sexual minority students and use inclusive words and terms. Next is implementing professional development opportunities and encouraging school staff to attend and learn how to create safe and supportive school environments for all students regardless of sexual minority status. So expanding that education to more than just the students, but also the teachers who are going to be educating them. Next is making it easier for students to have access to community-based healthcare. And this is because obviously there is health disparities that have to do with just whether or not they can go to the doctor and whether or not they will receive proper care at the doctor because of discrimination. So providing them a way to where they will be treated equally. Next is promoting parent engagement through outreach efforts and educational programs that provide parents with the informational and skill-based things that they need to help support sexual minority youth. So these are just some ideas, but if schools could implement some or all of these practices, stigma and discrimination and therefore health disparities could be improved.
Now we're going to talk about identity development among adolescents, and I first want to talk about the cognitive functions going on during adolescence to better understand mental health issues. So adolescence is a period where identity development and self-realization really come into play. This change is attributed to how cognitive development in adolescence becomes more abstract and more complex. One aspect of this abstract self-realization is the ability to distinguish an actual self between possible selves. So these possible selves fall into two categories: the ideal self, which the person the adolescent would like to be, and a feared self, the person the adolescent imagines they could become but dreads becoming. These two selves interplay with one another and often leads to pressures, and when the actual self and the possible selves differ from one another, it could lead to depression and failure, thoughts of failure. So one aspect of this complex self-realization is the ability to distinguish a false self. With an elevated cognitive function, adolescents are now beginning to realize their contradictory personalities and selves. With this realization comes a sense of false self, a self that they present to others while realizing that it does not represent what they actually are thinking and feeling. Along with an enhanced self-realization, adolescents are now confronting self-esteem, self-image, self-concept, and self-perception. Self-esteem is a person's overall sense of worth and well-being, while self-image, self-concept, and self-perception are all closely related, and they deal with the way people view and evaluate themselves. Erik Erikson founded a developmental approach to identity, in which adolescence is characterized by. So adolescence follows a stage of identity versus identity confusion, according to Erik Erikson, where the healthy path of identity is defining who you are and how you fit into the world around you, and the unhealthy path is failure to form a stable and secure identity. Among the LGBTQ plus community, Vivian Cass has found different stages of identity development. So these stages are identity confusion, where individuals have assumed an identity with the heterosexual or cisgender majority, and they begin to question this identity. Thoughts of, am I gay, begin to surface. Identity comparison is when individuals begin to feel socially alienated, feeling out of place or feeling different than those around them. Identity tolerance are when individuals become more confident and conscious of their LGBTQ plus identity and often find solace in the subculture. Although not quite accepting of their full identity, individuals in this stage tolerate their identity. Identity acceptance is when individuals interact and connect more with the LGBTQ plus community and begin to validate their identity. Identity pride is when individuals clearly identify with and accept the LGBTQ plus community. In this stage, individuals may reject the heteronormative and cisgendered culture they once thought of themselves to belong to. And in identity synthesis, individuals no longer emphasize their LGBTQ plus identity, but they consider it a part of all of their identities. Both of these approaches are under criticism for promoting a linear approach to identity development, when identity development does not follow a linear approach at all. Sometimes some individuals don't even go through the different stages that Cass has, and sometimes adolescents don't fully accept their identity, so they don't follow identity versus identity confusion. So how does this relate to the LGBTQ youth and mental health issues? So not only are these individuals confronting new thoughts of self-actualization from enhanced cognitive function in adolescence, they also deal with the countercultural views of being LGBTQ. Studies have found that the size of the discrepancy between the actual and ideal self is related to depressed mood in adolescence. Cross-sectional studies with LGBTQ plus individuals have found that more experiences and internalization of minority stressors are associated with a lower self-acceptance of sexuality, and that lower self-acceptance is associated with negative mental health, i.e. greater global distress, depression, and lower psychological well-being. Along with self-realization among LGBTQ plus youth, there comes identity exploration and how well these individuals fit into the world around them. One study found that because of their LGBTQ+ identity, adolescents were rejected by their peers and even bullied. This peer rejection fuels negative mental health outcomes. A quote from one of the participants in the above study mentioned says, "I see depression, I see anxiety, I see suicide, suicidal tendencies. I see that. I can imagine not being accepted. And then you're so sad and depressed and you don't want to even get out of bed because you realize my life is over. My parents don't accept me. Nobody else accepts me. It's over." And this is only one of 92 responses of the study. Also, a documentary about transgender adolescents depicts their mental toll of not being accepted and ridiculed because of their sexual identity. A little background of this clip is that a transgender youth named John talks about his struggle with identity and anger issues.
One small step for man.
Yeah, there's a place for us. Yeah, there's a place for us. Where only we can go.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
Spit down the laws, knock out the lies. Make don't look at just fine. 'Cause there's a place for us. Yeah, there's a place for us. But as long as we're together, we can go anywhere.
They're damned, and that's how we grew up. That's what we grew up thinking. But in time, I realized with regard to my child, this is the way he's felt on the inside for so long.
Merry Christmas, Gigi.
I mean, he could hardly speak when he was pulling on his tights saying, you know, this is not what I want and this is not who I am. I don't understand how you could be born that way and have that happen, and yet, you know, it's something that you could be damned for. It doesn't make sense to me.
Wave hi, everybody. Say hi. Say hi.
I always had a hard time making friends. I think part of it was that I was a very strange kid. I would just feel bad because every day I went to school, I just felt like everybody wanted me to go. Nobody wanted me there. Yeah, one time, this girl, we were in the girls' locker room, so we have to change for gym. She just went off on me. She was like, "Man, you're an ugly dyke. You know, you're a lesbian." It just kind of went from shaky to unstable to almost impossible. That's what it felt like. By the end, I was just trying to hang on. I started getting some anger issues in my sophomore year when I was very stressed out. Well, sometimes I would break and I would punch a hole in the wall or kick a hole in the wall or things like that. I would just get so mad. Eventually I could keep it from all spilling out, but it would spill in. I was just drifting off into this very violent experience into my head.
So that clip shows how John's feelings of not being accepted in his school and even being ridiculed led to anger issues and frequent outbursts. So what can we do now to address and aid mental health issues concerning identity development? So adolescents, like John, flock towards online sites and social media applications to find community and acceptance when faced with self-realization and identity exploration. When you don't have that community in school, you go to digital sites. So one study conducted by Jessica Stank and colleagues found that LGBTQ youth are driven to digital interventions because of isolation and stigmatization and lack of knowledge from their peers. Especially in this digital age where more social media community pages are prevalent, these social media community pages and groups could be and should be encouraged among adolescents and authorities, especially through the LGBTQ plus community. Websites such as YouTube and Tumblr house videos of LGBTQ plus experiences. These videos instill a sense of community within adolescents. These social media pages and digital interventions could both serve as a learning and information guide to combat the stigmatization and lack of knowledge from their peers, and it could also be a safe space for LGBTQ plus youth.
This is our story.
The Black church has sustained the African American people from the days of slavery to this day.
I don't know how we could have survived as a people without it.
The role of music in the Black church is everything.
We had to have some individual and institutional armor in order to preserve our sanity.
We are a testament to the goodness and the grace of God.
The Black Church, now streaming only on PBS.
Difficult environment. I mean, I know that we do informed consent, but really, I mean, how realistic is it to believe that a 14 or 15-year-old or 16-year-old has really the capacity to make that kind of decision for him or herself? But at the same time, to deny them, that's tough. I mean, this is tough stuff.
Okay. But so I guess around 11, I injected testosterone into my body. And so today's my first day, like, being born, I guess.
I watch lots of YouTube videos of, like, Skylar 11 and stuff, so, like, having him, like, kind of explain everything through his videos have helped me a lot.
So this is kind of like me pre-testosterone, but some's like floating around through my bloodstream right now. And I feel really good.
I looked at other videos. I realized that they were exactly like Skylar 11, that they had the same thoughts and the same, like, views of things.
These are my muscles pre-T.
That was just a clip of how YouTube could provide community and visual aid for the LGBTQ plus youth community.
Okay, so in order to evaluate our plans to address each of the issues we presented, we would utilize surveys to measure the success of the models we created. And this would be the best form of measuring our success just because it would allow for self-reported feelings of, like, satisfaction and success for anyone who is involved. For addressing discrimination and mental health issues among LGBTQ plus youth, we hypothesized that promoting family-centered interventions, establishing more gay-straight alliance groups in schools, and raising awareness to reduce harassment and bullying experienced by LGBTQ plus youth will lead to lower rates of discrimination. To address health disparities, the creation of a positive school environment will have a positive impact on LGBTQ individuals' mental health, since it will provide more social support and acceptance, which relates to Taylor's protective factors identified in earlier parts of the presentation. And lastly, in addressing identity development, we hypothesize that creating social media community pages and groups will have a positive impact on identity development of LGBTQ plus youth, since it creates a sense of community and pride. To close out our presentation, we have created 3 questions for everyone to reflect on. First, how might you help an LGBTQ plus adolescent struggling with mental health issues? Do you find digital interventions more helpful than in-person interventions concerning mental health issues among LGBTQ youth? Why or why not? And lastly, why do you think it is hard for LGBTQ youth to find beneficial interventions than their heteronormative peers? And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.